Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm glad to see we've got some people from all around the place. I saw some New York and some Iowa and some in between there as well. So glad to be spending the next hour and a half together. And like Emma said, they'll be monitoring the chat box. We'll mostly do questions at the end. Emma and I talked a couple days ago and also said if there's sort of something really pressing or that's really specific to a slide that she will let me know and we can answer that question right away as well. So without that, I think let's get started. So thanks. I want to say thank you to PFI for organizing these. It's been a lot of fun both doing builds over the last decade and also getting to know everyone that has come and gone and is still at PFI, and also getting to know so many of the members as well and working on their farms throughout Iowa. Just real quickly, something that always is really important for me when I think about working with PFI is that when I was at Penn State for grad school in horticulture, we read Farming for Us All in one of the classes that I was in the early 2000s, and I had never heard of PFI. Never done anything with them, and I always think about wow, what a cool organization this is, and the work that they do, and so it's been really nice to kind of almost 20 years later look back and see how nice it's been to work together with them. So I will also give a plug for them. They didn't ask me to do this, but if you are not members, please feel or please join them if you can, or send them some money and donate to them. We're in Michigan, we're members, and we love the organization and love being a part of it. So all right, so let's talk about some high tunnel weather or storm protection and routine maintenance. So this is a picture of part of our farm. So there we've got, those are 6 different high tunnels. This one wasn't taken yesterday or today. The previous slide was taken this afternoon. It just felt like we were looking around for pictures, and it just really was a great sunny, warm day here. So I hope that those of you in Iowa got that yesterday, and I hope those of you out in New York way get that tomorrow. So it felt good to be out and about. So I think the important thing to say before we hop into this is that that sometimes there'll be storms like the derecho, and these are not going to survive them. So unfortunately, that's the case, but there are definitely plenty of other storms that are big and strong and windy or powerful. And hopefully we can talk about a few things tonight that you're either already doing to your tunnels or that you can think about adding in. And hopefully that'll help you out in anything that you're facing, whether that's snow loads or big, strong, powerful winds. So for tonight, we're going to be talking about high tunnels, and I think in general, so we all have a sort of image in our head of something similar to these, sort of a Gothic shape, or we can have a Quonset sort of rounded shape or half circle shape as well. But we're not going to be talking about sort of field tunnels or things where they're put up temporarily, moved around, that type of thing. Just so that we're sort of all on the same page of what we're talking about today. That's where we're at. So all right, next slide, please. All right, so first and foremost, perfect. First and foremost, we're going to talk about some orientation. A lot of times when we talk about them, we think about orientation in terms of, how are we going to get the best wind flow through them to vent? The other thing that we want to be thinking about, especially if we're in really flat, open areas, which the next couple pictures after this, so you'll see those are taken in the Upper Peninsula, which is pretty flat and open and get some really big winds and storms that come down through there as well. So orientation, thinking about if you do have, tunnels or alleys where you get big winds on your farm, or if they're, up near the top of a hill or those types of things, we want to be thinking about, how we can orient these so that they cannot get blasted all the time by that, and that might be a balance between, saying we'd like them to be east-west oriented for maximum sun. But especially in the winter, maximum sun, but if that means that they're just going to get beaten up over and over and over again, and especially if you have strong winds and that are really constant coming across, that you may end up, wanting to switch them to go north-south. It's kind of a trade-off that you have to make. You might have less light coming into them in the winter, but you might have, longer longevity or less chance of them getting hit really hard. A couple of the ones that we've built up in the Upper Peninsula with farmers up there, we definitely, oriented them that direction, the north-south, because of some of the winds that they got. And one of the farmers that we work with up there oriented them that way because they get strong north winds. And then instead of putting plastic, like you'll see on most of these pictures, plastic or polycarbonate, he ended up building some plywood end walls. And putting plywood both on the outside and the inside of the 2x4 framing, just so that he could have, that taking, that plywood taking the brunt force of all those winds and storms that they get where his site was located. So, all right, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about inside a little bit and parts of it that we're using to make them stronger. So a lot of the kits will come with trusses. So you can see those are the pieces that are up at the top of the picture, that are going across and then have the W shape to them. There's a lot of different designs for the trusses. But usually once you get over 20, depending on the manufacturer, 22 or 24 feet, you really want to make sure that you have trusses on those on those bows. Some manufacturers will sell them with no trusses at all, and they're extra kits that you need to buy to be able to add to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to know that when you're comparing prices, if you're looking at something that has trusses on every bow or every other bow versus a price of something that doesn't have any trusses, the one without the trusses is definitely going to be less expensive, but we need to know why. And then if you're in a place where you're getting any sort of snow load at all, you definitely want to make sure that you've got some truss supports on those. So the different designs are, you can see here, this one is in every other bow. 3 of our houses have them on every bow because the manufacturer does that. 3 of them have them every other because it's a different manufacturer that we bought used down the road from us when a farmer moved and just moved them. And so this is one of the ones that is in every other bow. And this has had, let's see, I'm trying to think, I don't remember what year it was when it was such a bad snowstorm around Christmas, and we lost snow and ice storm, and we lost power for about 10 days. But this tunnel has had about an 1.5 layer of ice, and then on top of that, it had about 3 feet of heavy wet snow, and it didn't collapse. So if they were going to go down, they were going to go down at that point, and in that storm. So again, the manufacturers, it'll vary, but you definitely want to be having those on there if you're over 22 or 24 feet wide. So what that does is when all the weight of the snow is pushing down on top of it, it really transfers all of that weight out to down the trusses and out the horizontal pieces to the bows and then down into the ground. So if we didn't have them on these, those houses would have definitely collapsed with that ice and snow that we had on there. And you can see again on these, this manufacturer does a W shape. So you can see how they're split like 2 V's there or a W. Some other manufacturers will do just 1 on each side, which the next slide, if we want to go to there, has an example of another type of truss that you can see there. Another type of truss that it just has 2 pieces. You can see the one that's up attached to the bow. This was one of the first builds that we did, where we used to build the trusses on the ground, or build the bows on the ground and then assemble the trusses up above. We now just assemble them all on the ground and stand them up. So But you can see it's the same idea. It's just a different design. Some other ones will be similar to this, where it has the two on the side, and it may have one that comes down from right at the peak down and holds onto the truss as well. So that's just another way to strengthen those trusses. And again, I think if you're worried about snow and snow load especially, you can make sure that you have them on every bow, but at least every other bow minimum. Oh, the other thing that you can see here is the ridge cap. So that's the ridge purlin that runs down the top there. Adding those in as you get wider. So usually the 30-foot wide ones have at least 5 of them. One on the peak, and then one down towards where it starts to curve, and then one in between those middle, in the middle of those two distances. And so, attaching those on are helping everything hold together. The other thing that some people have started to do now, and I know a couple that when we did the rebuilds from the derecho last fall, a couple of the tunnels there also had the manufacturers send another purlin, and they put it right on the truss and tied all of the trusses together there as well. So I think that's something that that is, if you're concerned and you want to add some extra protection or some extra strength to it, you can go ahead and add that other purlin running down. So you'd have in this case, this is a 30-foot wide one. You'd have the 5 on top, and then you would have another one that sat right on the trusses and tied everything together there. We're going to talk about the next slide, wind bracing. And so here you can see, this is that site where I was talking about up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where it ended up going north-south, and that wall that we're standing by there ended up being the plywood end wall there. So adding extra wind bracing is definitely a good idea. It's inexpensive in the scheme of it, and to add some wind bracing to each corner. If you're paying $10,000 or $12,000 for a tunnel, adding, or even $6,000 or $7,000 depending on the manufacturer, adding a few $100s in for wind bracing, knowing that it's going to really support the structure, is a great idea. So here you can see the standard one for these are the 2 pieces that are down below, in between the baseboards and the hip boards. So down closer to the ground there, you can see them behind the ladder, running on an angle from that third bow up to the end bow. So that's the standard for this design of this house. And because it was such a windy area, we had 4 more pieces shipped for each corner. So 16 more pieces, and you can see we're putting those up from the top of the hip board, and that'll go up and hit the end wall as well. So, adding those extra wind bracing, that they'll run on a diagonal, and depending on the manufacturer, they'll connect a couple different ways. Sometimes they're like these, where it's a single piece in between. Sometimes it's a long piece, which we've got in a few slides we'll look at, that spans over a number of bows. And sometimes they'll go from like this, from the bows up to the end wall. We've built a couple other ones, actually one of them for sure, I think 2 of them that we built at the derecho rebuilds had something like this, where it went up to the end wall, and then it also went from the end wall back up to the peak of the 3rd or 4th bow. So that was just adding more additional wind bracing, more additional diagonals, especially if you're worried about it being in a high wind area. It really keeps them from once they get moving and swaying around, it really keeps them firm and tight and held together. So wind bracing is a must. And again, just like the trusses, there's some companies that will include them on there, and some companies that won't. So if you're concerned about it, you can always ask, make sure that there's wind bracing that comes with yours, and know if it's either included in the price that they're giving you, or if it's something extra you need to buy. All right, next slide, please. All right, yeah, so here's another example in the corners. of the individual pieces that don't necessarily line up with each other, but they are attaching to each of the bows. And those of you that have built them know, even if you get all the purlins and the trusses and everything on, you can still usually grab them and give them a good shake and get them rocking pretty easily. But as soon as you start to put these on in the corners, it really firms everything up and tightens everything up as well. All right, next slide, please. So this is just another example. You can see where this one spans 3 bows. So it's connected to the one on the left, which is an end bow, and then it goes down and connects to the third bow there as well. So again, the important part is to make sure that they are on an angle like this. I've been to some builds where people have installed them, or been to some farms where people have installed them straight across. And that's not doing anything for them in terms of wind bracing. They need to be on a diagonal like this so that they can do what they're supposed to do. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So here's something that doesn't always happen, but that we've been doing for a while now, and some of the manufacturers are recommending it as well, is that when you're using either a band like this is connecting the hip board to the bow, or when you're using the brace bands, which is sort of the way most of the trusses attach to the bows, is with a band that goes around them, and then usually a bolt that goes through it where it's pinched at the end, is coming back and putting an extra self-tapping or tech screw through those bands. So over time, with heat and cold and weather and wind and storms and all that stuff that happens, things get loose, even if they're tightened down. And but you can see here, the two up on the top there, the two bolts with the nuts on them, over time, those will get loose. And if we don't have this extra tech screw in here, what ends up happening is, and we've seen it happen in storms, is that they'll get loose in that hole. In this case, the hip board can slide up the bow higher, or up at part of the bow, or at one end, or in the middle, and that really tears the plastic. And going through and tightening the nuts and bolts, is not something that we always think about. We do it occasionally, but having these extra screws in there is really helpful. And we don't put them in every one for the base boards or the hip boards. We usually go ahead and just put them in every other one. It's enough to keep them in place. And then we also go through and check them. So what ends up happening, even though they might be galvanized or they might be zinc plated, eventually over time they'll rust and they'll break off, or they'll get really weak. And so we'll go through, and it could look like this, but we'll wiggle the end of it, and they can be broken off, it rusted off inside. And so we want to come through. We don't come through and do it every year, but we come through every so often, and when we're thinking about it, and go ahead and check those. And if it's rusted off, we go ahead and put another one in. Same thing goes for the braces on the trusses. We like to put a tech screw through those, and it's especially easier to do now, that when you build them on the ground. And so, putting that in, and the important part about those that are on the bow, these are less so, but for the hip boards or base boards, because of where they are. But for the ones on the bows, you want to make sure that they're not on the top of the bow, because when you go ahead and pull that plastic, then that's going to be a wear spot on it. So we put it on the face of the bow. And if you are like the person who taught me how to build them, you put them all on the same side, and then that side faces away from the main door entrance. So when you come in, you don't see any of those nuts or those tech screw heads on there. It looks nice and clean, but you've got them back behind there, and they're doing their job to keep things from even if the nut does come loose a little bit, keeps it from sliding around. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about plastic installation. We had the fortunate, or unfortunate, however we want to look at it, job of covering 5 of our 6 tunnels this year. The way that we built them and when we switched plastic before, that's just how it came up, that they were all ready to be changed out, except for one. So the big thing with plastic installation is to make sure that it's tight, to make sure that you're doing it when it's the right temperature. We like it to be in the 60s or so, usually, if we can, 60s to 70s. We don't like it too hot, but we also don't like it too cold. What we don't want to do is get it on when it's 35 or 40 out and it's really tight, and then as it warms up, it expands and it loosens up. So we like to have as many hands on deck as possible. We've done it with as few as 3 for a 30 by 96 foot house, though that's definitely not what we would recommend. I like to have, if at all possible, I think 8 is a great number to do that with. Although again, that's not always possible to rally some employees and/or employees and friends and neighbors to be able to get that on. So there's a number of different ways that people do it. We usually like to attach one end and pull all the slack to the other end, and then go down the sides, pulling the slack out as we go, and then do the final end. And then usually we come back to that first end and make some adjustments if we need to. We've also done it, which we did it 2 times this year, which I liked a little mix up of it, is we started in the middle, we got it up and squared and started in the middle and went each direction on the hip board first, and then on both sides, and then we did the ends, and that way we could not have to pull 96 feet of slack out. It was more like pulling 48 feet of slack one direction and 48 feet of slack the other direction. But what we definitely want to make sure that we take our time and we get it tight. Once the plastic, those of you who have either lost tunnels or thought you were going to lose tunnels when the plastic started flapping because it's loose, know what that sound is. I was in a conference session one year, and the presenter said, his hell is the sound of plastic flapping, and so that's not a sound that we want to hear. And the tighter and more secure we can get that sheeting down, the less it's going to whip around even in the wind. All right, next slide, please. All right, so plastic repair and replacement. They sell greenhouse tape for a reason, and we always, whenever we buy a new tunnel, we always buy a roll or a couple rolls of greenhouse plastic or greenhouse tape, repair tape or patch tape. When we buy it, we know we're gonna get holes in it, whether it's from installing it and it getting caught on a hip board or a screw or a nut or something, or a bolt or something, or over time we run into them, or we have something happen, or we just get a tear from, we've had a branch go through one where in a big storm, we have trees close but not that close to them, where a branch is broken and flown through the air and stuck into the plastic. So we want to make sure that when that does happen, that we are patching them as soon as possible. So what happens is, if we get a little tear, I like to think of it sort of as like the windshield, when you get a little chip in your windshield, if you don't fix it, it might be small for a while, but eventually it starts to grow. And and if you get plastic flapping around and it's got a tear in it, that just continues to tear more and more and more. So making sure that we walk around them every so often, a couple times a year, and check for any tears or small holes so that we can patch them. That's not something that we used to do, but it's something that we started to do once we had some small tears that got a lot bigger that we hadn't noticed. So and then replacing your plastic as well. So the plastic that they sell for greenhouses is 4-year plastic. I think that in northern climates it's okay, we can get 6 years out of it. We've had some tunnels where we had it on for 8 years just to sort of see what happened. And the light definitely starts to go down, and the plants are stretching. So I think what we target is more in that 6-year span. And we can also see that we start to get, not just light degrading or getting cloudy and less light coming in, but we also get some plastic, breaking down and degrading. And, when it starts to get into that 7, 8 years, we start to have tears. 2 of them that we replaced this year or last fall were at 8 years. And a couple weeks before we replaced them, we had a pretty strong storm come through, and that we had already bought the plastic and knew we were replacing them, so we weren't that worried about it. But it flapped it against the bows pretty hard, and we got a tear, from one hip board to the other hip board, right on the second to last bow, in both of those houses in the exact same spot. So we want to replace it because of light levels for our plants, but we also want to replace it, because because of the chance of it tearing goes up when it starts to get into those later years of its life. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about inflation fans. So if you have 2 layers on your house, you either have some blocks between them, or more likely, a lot of the Amish guys by us have the either styrofoam or plastic blocks that they put between them. Or if you're using electricity, you've got some type of inflation fan that's keeping those 2 apart. So it looks fine here, but if we go to the next slide, you can see there's a lot of stuff in there. So dirt and dust and all kinds of things get in there. In this case, we had turned it off to do some other maintenance and repair. It was hardwired. We usually hardwire them in. And so we had turned the electricity off, and we hadn't turned it back on because we were still doing the job for a couple of days. And we ended up having a bird start to try to make a nest in the inflation fan here. They're also a favorite for wasps and yellow jackets if that isn't spinning. So I think if you've got an inflation fan, making sure that you're cleaning it out every so often. And then what we've started to do too is we don't have all of our high tunnels now have our only single layer plastic. We've got a couple at a site where we don't have electricity, but we have a greenhouse that we have 2 layers on. And so what we do is just go ahead and buy a second inflation fan that we keep in the barn or in the shop, so that, if something were to happen to it like this, where it doesn't start back up, it needs to be changed out, or, after a few years, usually we get 4, 5, 6 years of these, sometimes running constantly, they'll break down. And so having another one on hand, just to be able to inflate it or keep it inflated, is a good idea. The other thing is that, when we're thinking about storms, it's, as long as we have power, if we have these inflated, that they're going to be able to take those winds a lot better, being inflated and rigid like that, than if they're deflated and flapping around, especially with 2 layers. When they get deflated, there's a space or a gap between them. It's not like a tight plastic like it is on a single layer house. So having one of these on hand, or 2 of them on hand, extras, so if something were to happen and you need to replace them without having to order and wait for it to come in and then install it, is a good idea. All right, next slide, please. All right, let's talk about some roll-up sides. So I really like this picture because you can see what a roll-up side should look like on the left part of the house and the left side, and you can see what a roll-up side should look like on the right side of the house. So we like to have them nice and straight, so that we can get good ventilation. But also what ends up happening with the one on the right, why it's doing that is, where they swage together or where they come together, one of the tech screws or the self-tapping screws, like we talked about earlier, where they can rust off, that's sheared off. And so that pipe is about 4 or 5 pieces of pipe connected together with each other. And so when that piece shears off, or when that tech screw rusts off, when you start to crank it, that pipe at the far end is turning at a different rate or not at all than compared to the other ones that are turning and making the side go up. So we want to make sure that we're going through, if this is happening to our sides, that we take it down and go ahead and replace that screw. Usually what we've started to do with them now, since we had this happen on a number of houses, we're just going ahead, and we probably should have done it from the get-go. We're just putting 2 screws right next to each other into where they connect, so that we so that if one does rust off or shear off, that other one is there to make sure that it's working correctly. The other reason we want to do this is that as soon as they start turning at different spaces or different times like this, right where they connect, we're going to get a bunch of tearing of the plastic. So because the sharp part of the how the plastic's attached to the roll up, that starts to turn at a different speed also, and it ends up digging into the plastic. So we really want to make sure that we're keeping our roll up sides working well, 1 for ventilation, but also 2 for the life and longevity of the plastic. All right, next please. All right, let's talk about securing the roll up sides. So this is probably, it might not all, yours may not look exactly like this, but some type of system to secure these is mandatory. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen or got a call from a farmer where there was a windstorm, and what ended up happening is that the side, they didn't have these on, the side got blown out, and it ended up tearing off of the hip board and going up and over to the other side of the hoop house. So usually what happens with that is not only is the plastic ruined, but the roll up pipe is usually bent and ruined. The hip board is usually damaged. And so you end up, instead of, $30 in nylon rope that you could, and some Eyebolts, that you could have put on, you end up having to replace plastic and hip boards and roll up pipe as well. So again, it may not look exactly like this, but there should be some type of system. And if you have drop down sides, there should also be a similar type of system. Sometimes they use, depending on the manufacturer, they'll use a piece of metal to connect that sandwiches the roll up between the bow and that piece of metal, so that it can't blow out. Sometimes these are not zigzag like this. They're more individual pieces that are vertical and are maybe every 3 or 4 bows. Another thing that we've seen, not as much lately, but we used to see more, is you can buy, it's, I don't know what the name of it is, but it's like a seatbelt material. And we've seen people that would put an Eyebolt down into the baseboard, tie that, and then throw it up and over their tunnel and secure it to tie it onto an Eyebolt on the or stapled or connected some way like that, but onto the other side, other baseboard. What I like about that is if you don't get your plastic really tight, those can also act like another piece of support that's holding that plastic tight and taut and keeping it from whipping around and blowing away. So again, some type of rope, nylon rope on the sides, zigzagging or not, is needed from the hip board to the baseboard, or to hold that roll up side or drop down side in place. All right, next slide. All right, so here's a close up on how these Eyebolts are connected. So these are metal or aluminum hip boards, and this is just drilled through. If you go to the next slide, you can see that's the inside of it. So again, that's just drilled through with a bolt on the back side of it. If you wanted to, you could probably put a washer there, or you could put a washer and a bolt on both sides of it and hold it together, kind of sandwiched like that. This is another piece of maintenance that we come through and check pretty regularly. especially in the fall, and then also before we go into winter, and then in the early spring too, before we get big thunderstorms there that either come in the spring or those big summer thunderstorms that roll in also. We like to be able to check these, tighten them down. Something that I should also say that we're finally, I think after last fall when we redid 5 of the tunnels plastic, we finally are to a point where we have all of the bolts on, or sorry, all of the nuts on these is the same size. So that's another thing to think about. If you're doing multiple structures, that making sure that you have all of the same size nuts on things like this. It's not necessary, but it definitely makes things a lot easier than either walking back to the shop or the barn or carrying around a bunch of different size sockets to be able to make sure that you've got the right size for all the different houses that are there. So and you don't have to do it right away, but if you're switching things over, we take these off obviously to put new plastic on. So that's when we went ahead and switched over to having them all be the same size eye bolts, and the same diameter eye bolts and the same size nuts on all of them. All right, next slide, please. This is me admitting I'm not a good knot tire. I come from the school of knots of tie more. So these are a bunch of half hitches is usually how we tie them off. It works. That one on the right that was 8 years old, and it's still holding, did fine. And then on the left is the new one after we changed it out this year. The other thing that we've started to do now with these, and we've been doing the last couple times we've changed plastic, is go ahead and instead of having that rope be one long piece, is that we're splitting it into at least 2 pieces and sometimes 3 pieces, depending on if you run out of the spool. And the reason that we're doing that is because if one of them breaks and it's all one piece, then that whole rope is useless. So what we've done with them being 2 or 3 pieces is if one of them breaks, there's still ropes, and and of course they're going to break in a storm, and they're probably going to break in a storm at night, and it's going to be dark, and the last thing you want to be doing is running around trying to figure out if your rope's secure. So what we'd like to do is have those be multiple pieces, so if one does break, the other one is still holding things in place. All right, next, please. All right, let's talk a little bit about doors. So a couple different things that you can do with your doors, but you definitely want to make sure that all your latches are working, especially as you go into the winter. I know that we have a tendency in the summer, if a latch breaks, we put a rock in front of the door, or we do, something like that. But we definitely have started on maintenance of coming in and making sure that we have latches that are all working and secured. And we usually like to do that starting in September or October. And the reason we like to do that is because I don't like to be fixing door latches in December and January when it's cold and snowy and there's snow pushed up against the doors, and there's just not super pleasant to work in. So we like to make sure all of our latches and that are secured before we go, and functional and working before we go into the winter. And there are all different kinds. We usually just get some in the gate door or the fencing door section of the hardware stores. We don't have anything fancy on any of ours, but they do the job. And if they are bouncing around, putting something in front of them isn't a terrible idea. So, all right, next, please. For those of you that have sliding doors, my pain here. So we have one house that has sliding doors, and we usually end up with something like this. This was just taken today. I went in there to take some other pictures for this presentation, and then I went to go out and close it, and then I got to dig out some icy gravelly soil. So just make sure that when you go to close your doors, you've got either a track that they're riding in if you've got, sliding doors, or you have a hammer and something there that you can whack at it to get them cleaned out. So, all right, next slide, please. All right, shutters or shutters and motors. So some of you probably have shutters like this. Others have wooden ones. Some of them are manual. Some of them, where it's just a pull string or a pull cord that gets tied off. Some of them are on motors and a thermostat. So I think the important thing to make sure that we do for maintenance is usually every 2 to 3 months, we go ahead and we get up there. If they're up high, we have some up high like this and some down lower. If we have them up high, we get up there, make sure that the springs that are keeping them closed are working. Make sure that the chain that's attached to them, that's attached to the motor, isn't broken. Make sure that there's not something stuck in, or that usually the shutters are aluminum. They can get bent and then they won't open or close correctly. So we check those every few months. Usually in the summer, it's less often because we sort of just get to a point in June where they just get propped open and they stay open. Usually until sometime in October, depending on what the fall looks like. But we do like to check them, really regularly in the spring and then really regularly in the fall before we go into the winter, just to make sure that they're functioning, they're not binding up on themselves, or anything like that. So, and then next picture, please. And here's the motor on them. And again, there's different types of motors. They all function sort of the same, where there's the little arm that you can see with the chain that comes down and connects to it. And then when it opens, that pulls down. So, so you can go ahead and check on that and make sure the arm is working correctly. We usually have this one's up high. We usually have someone stand up there and someone else, flip the thermostat for it so that it and usually cycle it through a couple times, just to make sure, again, that it's working, that it's not binding up on itself, that it's not broken. And then we always check the arms also, depending on who the manufacturer is. Some of them we've had that are 12 years old now and are still working fine. Some we've had where it's a smaller plastic or a skinny metal arm, and we've had them break in 2 years. So similar to the inflation fans, we usually just keep a couple of these on hand, so that if we do need to use them, we can, or if we do need to replace them, we've got them on hand. We don't need to wait and have them be shipped in. All right, next, please. All right, so water lines, depending on where you are, you may have frost-free ones or you may not. So we have frost-free ones in our tunnels and on our farm, so we don't have to blow out lines or anything like that. But if you do have if they are not under or below the frost line, definitely need to make sure that they get blown out. It is no fun to come home to frozen pipes, and or the other thing that we've seen at some farms before is to have it freeze and then blow the top or crack the top off of these. One farm we were working with, they came home from vacation and they had it blow off and freeze, and it was just pouring water out of the top for a few days while they were gone. So just the maintenance on those, making sure that they're blown out if you need to, or if they're frost free like this one is, making sure that the drain mechanism down on the bottom, the little hole that lets that water drain out, making sure that that's working correctly, and making sure also that when you turn these off, that there's not any little leaks or anything like that. We ended up finding a leak just a couple of days ago, and so we just shut the line off from the basement because we're not, or from the line that goes out from the well to there, so that we can repair this one in the spring. But this has been in place for 13 years and we've never had an issue with it, but it's time now to replace it. So just monitoring those and watching them and making sure that that they're set up so that they're not going to crack or freeze. Okay, next, please. And then if you have overhead irrigation, the same thing, making sure those lines are either blown out or they're set up so that they can drain, or that you take the bottoms off of them so that they can drain out. The last thing you want is to go out and try to use them and them, especially in the spring, and them either be broken or frozen up and not functioning because you left water in them. So, all right, next slide, please. And remember to drain your hoses. This was one of the first pictures I ever took in a tunnel, probably almost 20 years ago. I've got more use out of this picture than I think anyone I've ever taken. This always happens. It always happens with new employees. It's no fun to have to either bring this into somewhere heated and let it thaw out or drain out, or bring it into the bathtub or the shower or anything like that. So, just making sure if you are watering in the winter, that you're draining the hoses, or you've got a way to bring them inside and a spot to put them in. So, all right, next, please. All right, so let's talk a little bit about interior covers. So we've got a few slides here to talk about these, and then we're getting closer to 9. So I think we can open up to Q&A after these next couple slides. So just a word about interior covers. There's an example here that it's with plastic and conduit. The next slide, which we'll get to in a minute, is with row cover and some high tensile wire. There's also lots of other designs where it's individual beds with hoops, or a couple beds with hoops, usually from plastic conduit or from bent wire. I think what we want to make sure, important part of it and maintenance of this is making sure that our support system is good and functioning. We've definitely talked to farms or heard from farms where, they didn't have their supports in place, or they tried to go less supports, or they didn't make sure that, in this case, there's 3 or 4 pieces of conduit that form these pipes, that they hadn't connected them and secure enough, and so that they had them fall apart, and then the plastic in this case, which is much heavier than the row cover, fall down right on top of the plants, and then it got sunny, and it definitely, especially under the plastic, can cook the plants. So just making sure that your support systems are in shape before you go ahead and start using these throughout the winter. And I can say, what on our farm, we've moved away from using any covers. We tried it was fine when we had 1 or 2 tunnels, but with 6 of them now, for a while, it just became too much time to sort of go out and manage and pull and push. And seemed like by the time we got out there, by 10:30, 11, after it sort of thawed out and warmed up, by the time we got them open, they were only open a few hours before we had to start pulling them back over, in those days where it gets dark at 4:30. And so what we've started to do instead is just try to instead of dealing with these, we just try to sell out of things coming out of the tunnels in middle-ish to end of December, and then take usually January off from anything in the tunnels, and then get back in there and get things turned around and going. So all right, next slide, please. All right, and then this is a picture here of just another option for an internal cover. And with these ones, since you can see where the 4 lines are, where it's sort of riding higher, that's high tensile wire. So the important maintenance for this is to make sure that those are taut, that you've got the right tension on them, that they can support the weight of this, and that where you've got them tied into, in this case, they tie into the far end wall. That you can see up close, it's on a post, but at the far end, it's tied into the wall. And so just making sure that everything is secure there, that we're not pulling our wall too much, that we're not bending or putting too much strain on either wood, or in this case, it's metal, that we're not pulling that wall in. And then the other piece is we've had to definitely over time replace some of the wire tensioners that you can see in the foreground here. Making sure that we have those on hand. I think what we've learned, and what I keep saying is we have a couple of extra of everything on hand, and I think what we've learned is that that's a good idea because we've been in places where we don't have things on hand. So having extra high tensile or strainers around is just a good thing to have in case something were to break or go wrong. So, all right, next one. I think that should be it. Yeah. So, and this was from today. I was super excited. We got our greenhouse cleaned up and then got our heater working and fixed a couple things on it. And so it felt like, man, this is a good thing to look forward to. We're almost there. And I'm sure there's some of you that have already got things going. So with that, I think we can take some questions. Emma, how do you want to do questions? Do you want to?
So I will look at the chat box and see where to begin.
I'm going to open my door because one of our cats is just pounding on it. So I'll be right back.
Oh my gosh. I've got a cat on my lap currently.
Go ahead. All right.
All right. So looks like we've got one question to start, a couple questions. So someone said, snow is an issue for light, of course, but is there a depth of snowfall when you should get that snow cleaned off for the good of the structure, and how to clean that off?
Sure. So yeah, so that's a great question. I agree that it's a light issue. What we've chosen to do Gothic structures, so shaped like this rather than can you see me? Is that?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay, I wasn't sure if how the cameras were working. Yeah, so shaped like this instead of the Quonsets. The Quonsets, they tend to definitely rest more snow up on top. And so I feel like our Gothics shed snow. We had the huge big storm last week, and right now, even before we had this sunshine and warm temperatures today, they've shed snow off of them. So I think that the Gothics help. I would say that when we start to get more than a foot or so of snow on there, I used to start to get a little bit worried, and we would go out and knock them off. I think the best is I think there's kind of two options that we used to do. One was from inside, taking a push broom and putting a towel on it, and then kind of pushing that sort of gently up to sort of shed the snow off. Another one is to work outside with a push broom as well, and to get up there and pull it down off of there. I think the big thing is making sure that we are not poking holes in our plastic. And then the other thing is when we've got really big storms that come one after the other thing is being able to get some of that snow that's being shed off away from the side, because if it just builds up there, if it just builds up there, there's nowhere for it even to shed off anymore. So we've come through with tractor or with I've seen some farms that use a snow blower to do it. And so if you get a lot of heavy storms and a lot of heavy snow right after each other, being able to make that make a space where the snow can shed off of there.
Thank you. Another person wanted to know if you had any tips on starting a new line for a row of water faucets. There is no sprinkler system, just a home well currently.
On starting a new, sorry, I'm looking at the questions here. Oh, so so the question is how to lay water. Maybe it looks like this is a question from Lisa Guy. So Lisa, can you maybe type up in the chat box? So a new line, like how to bury a new line, or could you maybe just let me know more what you're asking? And our cat's drinking out of the fish tank, so I'm gonna move it.
Yeah, Lisa wants to know about splitting off.
Okay. I don't have any tips to that. When we moved into our house, it had, she's okay. It already had a line coming out going back to a barn that was, it runs off our home well as well. And we pump a lot of water out of that. And it, so it runs out of our basement through the wall, and then is a line that goes outside. So I have never had to do that. We've laid lines off of that one, but the main line was already out there. So maybe if someone else has any ideas, or that has done that, would be happy to type your answer into the chat box as well.
All right. Thank you. So someone else wanted to know, how long does it take for the whole setup? I think that from start to finish for a high tunnel, I believe.
So we've done, depending on the number of hands, we've done them in a day, a 30 by 96 foot in a day. That was a lot of people, and a lot of people that knew exactly what they were doing. So it was like no brain, no what's happening next. How do we connect this? It was just sort of like everyone go and do it. But in general, I think it usually takes, if you've got someone that's got some experience to guide you through, it usually takes about 3 days is a fair thing to say, I think, with a handful of, 4 to 6 people type thing.
Great. Cool. Thank you. Someone else wanted to know, how interchangeable are the high tunnel parts? So that, for example, can you make wind bracing pieces work with various high tunnels? Sure.
So I would say, depending on the manufacturer, they are pretty interchangeable. So a lot of the, especially those pieces that are run on a diagonal, where it crosses multiple bows, those are the same pieces that company sends for purlin pipe as well, and for roll-up side pipe. So in that case, it works, to interchange those. In other manufacturers, they are specific, that they have like crimped ends, like those ones that were just going bow to bow. They've got crimps on both the ends so that you can put a brace band around the bow and then slide that in and clamp it at both ends. So, but the purlin pieces are pretty interusable for multiple things.
Here. All right. What are your thoughts about movable high tunnels? An individual wants to know.
So we've built a number of them. I think that they, like any tool, can work really well, but you have to be able to use them how they're supposed to be used. So I've seen a number of farmers have them, and they do an awesome job with them. They move them when they should be moved. They've got their cropping system down so that they can move off their spring onto their tomatoes, and then move off their tomatoes onto their fall crop, and do a really good job of that. I've also seen a number of farmers who end up making their movable tunnels stationary. So I think that I think that they're a great tool. But if you don't use the tool how it's supposed to be used, it's not gonna do its job, and you're gonna just end up paying, more money for something that you're not using to its, best capacity.
That sounds fair. And speaking of movable high tunnels, Liz Colby wants to know if you have any special maintenance tips you can recommend for movable tunnels on tracks.
Sure. So the tunnels on tracks, there's a couple different designs. So there's sort of the skids where it looks like a ski tip on the end, and you're pulling them to move them around. There's ones where they ride on a pipe that uses like a a parking garage wheel that, you know, would ride on the pipe, almost like a train track in a way, but without grabbing onto it. And then there's the ones like the V tracks that are really wide, that go up into a point in the middle, and the wheels, similar wheel, but it rides a little bit different, and it's not as rounded inside. So I think the biggest thing is making sure that that if you have a track that it's riding on, not the ski type, but the other ones, you know, making sure that that's secure to the ground and that it's level. I think with the V-track ones, that is by far, I would say it's two things. By far, it's the most expensive system. By far, it is also the system that I've seen work the best for movable ones. So yes, it's more money, but it also is the least headache prone ones that I've built or seen used on other farms. I think the ones that ride on the pipe, like the train a little bit style, those ones, you need to definitely make sure that that pipe lays flat and stays flat. So if you put it right on the ground, what ends up happening is it just over time sinks in, and then it's a real pain to use it. So with those, what we've seen people be successful with is going and putting sort of a ground cover barrier, and then putting some crushed rock on top of that, and then either having the pipe on the rock or folding it over so that it's riding on, you know, so the rail sitting on the gravel, rail sitting on the landscape fabric, then gravel, then more landscape fabric, and so that it just stays level. I would say that's the biggest thing with those. Does that answer your question, Liz? Oh, maybe the other thing, all right, the other thing about those is, all right, the other thing for those is to make sure that when you move it, you re-secure it back down onto the way, you know, whatever it's, there's lots of different systems to secure them down. I do know a farmer who didn't secure it down, and it ended up blowing and rolling, you know, in a storm end over end. After they moved it, they didn't secure it down to there. So that's definitely something to make sure that you do.
Oh, yikes. Yeah, for sure. All right, moving along. Another individual wants to know an average insurance cost per tunnel per year, and is it worth it to get insurance for your high tunnel?
So that's a great question. So we are actually doing an insurance review right now for our farm, and just making sure everything is good. I don't know offhand how much our tunnels are, but I do know our overall policy for our whole farm is around $1,800. That's 7 tunnels, a heated greenhouse, 6 production tunnels, a storage tunnel, a heated greenhouse, all of our farm equipment, so like tractor, UTV, riding lawnmower, all our hand tools, seed inventory, so all that stuff. And liability, $1 million per incident, general and product per incident. And so I think that that's not very much money in the scheme of it, for everything that they cover. And so I think that one, it's not very much in the scheme of it, and two, and those, I should say, those have a $500 deductible per tunnel on them. So if one tunnel breaks, or if one tunnel has something happen, and I pay $500 to replace a $10,000 to $12,000 tunnel, then, you know, that was 5 or 6 years of insurance payments, premium payments. So in my mind, I think it's definitely a good idea. I think it's a good idea, although there are definitely people who don't want to carry insurance, and I guess that's, you know, to each their own on that. I should say our insurance, because our tunnels are unheated, does not cover collapse from ice or snow load, because there's no heater in them. Our greenhouse is covered for that if our heater is running. If our heater is running, it shouldn't collapse from ice and snow load, because there shouldn't be any ice or snow. But that's the only stipulation that they put into our insurance policy for the unheated tunnels.
Great. So you answered the first part of the next set of questions about whether most of your tunnels are unheated, which is correct. What is your temperature in like December and January?
So it definitely depends on the weather. So like today when it was super sunny, and one of the houses that we don't have anything in right now, I mean, it was 80 in there. It was kind of nice. I went out to take pictures and I sort of hung out there a little bit. And so, but in general, I would say that it's bottoming out. If we have a cover in it, which we don't do anymore, but if we have a cover in it, what we ended up being would be somewhere around that 10 to 12. I don't know that we ever got below, we don't have temperature sensors in our tunnels here, but when I was at Michigan State, we had them as part of a research project. And even when we were minus 20 outside, minus 25 sometimes, we were bottoming out in that 10. I don't think we ever got below 10 degrees underneath the covers in there.
Gotcha.
And to go back, see in the comment box, I could not agree more with John of his insurance. That's a better way to say it than the way I said it. It may seem expensive until you lose a tunnel or two. That is a great way to say it. Yep. I feel like that's the same way with liability insurance. It's like, hopefully we don't ever have to use it. But if our tent blows over at the farmer's market because of a storm and hits someone, that's what we have it for.
Right, exactly. All right, so the last two parts of this question are, was the last slide in your PowerPoint during your break in January, and what thickness is your row cover?
So in there, that would have been, sometime in January or December. We used to do December, January, February harvesting. So that would have been sometime in the, definitely deep dark of winter. And that would have been Ag 30 is what we were using there.
Cool, thank you. All right. Do you recommend digging ditches filled with rock along the sides for water shedding? And do you prefer buried lower side walls?
All right, so those are two great questions. So where we farm, we're really sandy. Really sandy at one site and sandy loam at another site. So we have good enough drainage that we don't have issues with water coming off and then going back into the tunnel. We also have a lot of friends that farm on heavy clay, and most of our friends that farm on heavy clay have done some type of drainage like that along the side, whether it was, digging the ditch and filling it with rock, or digging a ditch and putting some rock in and then some drain tile, just to be able to move it away from the house. So I think that, it's if you are on a heavier clay or heavier soil, you're going to have issues of water coming back in, especially I think as we start to see, in the last 3 or 4 years, we used to have, in Michigan where we are, we're pretty consistent of used to be 3 inches of precipitation every month, pretty much across the board, month to month. And now, I mean, it's the last 3 or 4 years, we're easily getting, multiple 3-inch rain events in the same month, so, we have 3 storms that drop 3 inches each, and, and I don't think that, that's definitely something that's more common and more frequent. And I don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. So again, if you're on heavy soil, being able to move that away, that's a lot of water. If it's a 30 by 96 foot house, I think that's about, for every inch of rain, I think that's 1,800 gallons of water coming off your tunnel. So if you get 3 inches of rain, you're 50, whatever, 56, somewhere like that. 5,400 gallons of water in a 3-inch rain event. So it likes to go back in if it can't go down. And then the buried lower sidewalls. So we on ours now, we're building our our baseboards a little bit up off the ground, kind of about this far off, just because we're not level ground, and so we can run it on an angle. Sort of all of our houses are built on about a 3-degree slope end to end, because that's how the property that we farm on is. And so what we end up doing then is we come back with some landscape fabric. And if this is the, if this is the baseboard, we staple it here and then bring it down and pull it out, and then, staple it with landscape staples down there. And that way we don't have to worry about mowing or weed whacking or anything right up against the edges of those tunnels like that.
Awesome, thank you. On the same thread as maintenance, what do you do for soil maintenance? Any flushing, nutrients, and do you have a best tip as of late?
Sure, that's we used to do whole day long things on soil health and tunnels. So the elevator pitch version is we use a good amount of compost. It's kind of, we're probably putting 3 to 5 yards of compost in each tunnel, sometimes more, but in general, I think that would, throughout a season, between each crop, we like to do it if possible. And then I think we are also using some both liquid and granulated organic allowable amendments and fertilizers in them, especially for our tomatoes and peppers. They're such hogs for nutrients, and we jam them in there pretty close together. And so since we've been adding some more, mostly fish through fertilizer or through injector, we used to run out of nitrogen even when, even when we were putting kind of high amounts on in, later August or so. And now doing some injection, we've been able to keep it, keep those going as long as we want them until we have to tear them out for fall and winter crops. It's what is someone asked blood, it's Replenish is the trade. It's a poultry, composted poultry that's OMRI listed. So there's a couple of them that are that product. I think the tip, the hot take, I guess we'll call it, is not all compost is created evenly. Think about, and not all more isn't always better. So farmers that we know that have gotten into some issues with compost is when they've been putting large amounts on that are animal-based composts, and they're not getting anything flushing that system out like was asked. And so they've definitely had some issues with phosphorus, especially high levels of phosphorus. So I think we usually use mostly a plant-based compost, and that is maybe it's lower nutrients, but it's adding some organic matter in as well.
Thank you very much. All right. What is the limit for installing a tunnel on a slight slope? What do you do surrounding?
Sure. So ours are all on about a 3-degree slope. I think I'll say I have nothing to back this up on or with, but I would be hesitant to go much more than twice that, in that sort of 5 to 6% slope. I think I could just see, I don't know. For some reason that feels not like something that I would want to do. But out east, we used to build them all level. Even on, the first one we built level on our property, and then we went out to New England and worked with some farmers out there, and some of them have no flat ground anywhere on their farm, and they had them on some pretty big slopes and some pretty big pitches. So that's why I think we came back and felt comfortable building them on that 3% slope. So
that sounds fair. All right. What style of end wall would you recommend for a caterpillar tunnel that's 14 feet by 100 feet?
So I think there's a couple options there. Those of you who know me know that I don't think I ever say this is the way you should do it, and this is exactly the only way you should do things. So I think that, farmers that we've seen using those successfully have either done the sandwich bag or the bread bag tie off. I don't know if they call it that in Iowa, that's what they call it here, where it's just extra plastic and you cinch it off. And there's a farmer that we work with down near outside of Detroit that he has a lot of that size tunnel, and he just builds a plywall end wall on them. And it's something that he can put on really easily. He can take it off to get a tractor or a tiller in there, and then he can put it right back on as well. So I think that those are two good options. I think you could always do I think you could also do just a plastic one as well. Just like, put a piece of channel on there, a wiggle wire channel, and a piece of 2x6 on the bottom, and put a piece of plastic on the end too.
Great, thank you. By the way, thanks everybody. These are great questions. I'm gonna keep plugging along. We've got about 10 minutes left. Any thoughts about pre-designed greenhouses for use on urban sites that are skid mounted and can be moved as needed?
So the hard part of the skid is it can only go like this, right? It can't go like this. So even if you want to move it like from this spot on a farm to this spot on a farm, I've seen farmers take it like way down and do a big, loop around and come back. So I think that if you were trying to move it around a lot, that would be the challenge, is how much space do you have in this location? And you need it to go, laterally as well. Another option would be to say, like, you're just going to build something like that and not move it. I'm guessing the question is either because there's something going on with the soil, either quality or chemically, and then so you're trying to do something where you can then not drive posts or something into the ground. If that's the case, I think you could just say you're going to do a one on skids to maybe not move it, but you would be able to not have to drive posts into the ground. Does that make, maybe whoever asked that question, if they want to throw something up in the chat box, we can come back to that as well, if that wasn't anywhere along the lines of what you were thinking.
Yeah. All right, that'd be great. Thank you. All right. What is the best plastic? Do you have a preferred kind? I think the person in the chat wanted to know, especially surrounding UV rays.
So I really like the Tough Light 4 brand. That's, again, I'll say, like, that's not the only brand out there. We've had Clerks on 50 on ours before, but I feel like the Tough Light is a great plastic. That's what we bought for all of our the 5 we just redid. We have less issues with that than we have had with some other brands getting punctured by the wiggle wire or that. So and then we usually get, since we're single layer, we usually do get the UV and anti-condensate plastic. We didn't get that this time around because it was something, because of everything going on in the world. It was like a 4-month wait for us to be able to source that. And it was like, we needed to do it, in September and October, not in, I didn't want to be trying to cover plastic in April when we're trying to get everything going and just, the list is long. So, yeah.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. One person says that they have high bicarbonate well water and was wondering if there was any way to rectify that issue without using acids or reverse osmosis. That's
a great question. So we have the same issue. I think most of the Midwest has this limestone aquifer that gives us high bicarbonate water. So what we have done and what a lot of farmers around here do is use elemental sulfur. So if you're certified organic, or if you're growing with organic practices, that would be the way to do it. You can get it in a powder, or the I don't know what the technical term for it is, but they look like little yellow lentils. So I just call them like lentil sulfur. And that's a lot easier to spread and measure out than the powder is. And it takes pretty high rates to be able to depending on what your pH is, and that to drop it, to drop it down. And it also takes time because it has to convert that sulfur to sulfuric acid. So then that's what's actually dropping the pH. But in that's a biological process. If you are not certified organic, or you're not following organic practices, or farming organically but not certified, you can use ammonium sulfate as your nitrogen source, and that'll also be transferred over to, or be converted over to, sulfuric acid is one of the things that will come from that, and you'd be able to drop your pH again without knowing your growing practices. But those would be, organic option would be elemental sulfur, and conventional option or other option would be sulfuric acid, or I'm sorry, ammonium sulfate as the nitrogen source.
That's good, thank you. Here's kind of a fun one. Are there any design ideas that you or farmers thought would be clever and turned out not to work?
That's a really good question. I'm sure there's a lot of them. I think the internal frame that supports the plastic covering, that's a lot of money tied up in metal conduit because that plastic is so heavy. So I don't know that it works, and it runs, it protects the plants, and it works well. But I think that there's definitely, a good chunk of expense that goes into that. So I don't know what else. Trying to space tomatoes at 6-inch spacing. Maybe that definitely does not work out. So jamming too many crops in there because you think you have to, make up for all of the space all of the time.
Yeah. Oh, funny. All right. Any other questions from the chat?
All right.
Well, so that looks like it. Oh, my internet might be dying, but thank you all for attending tonight's Farminar. Thank you so much for hosting, Adam. Thanks, Maggie, for helping behind the scenes. And most importantly, thank all of you for joining us tonight. Next week, Celise, our next generation coordinator, will host a Farminar with Rodrigo Cala about navigating the first steps to farming and land access. He'll be focusing on organic vegetable production and accessing land. Fair warning, this Farminar will be hosted primarily in Spanish, so come prepared for that. And with that, everybody, have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Adam.
We'll see you later.